Hello and welcome back to Magic and the Noise.
When most people think of the Stargate program, they immediately, of course, think about remote viewing, but some people might not realize there is another half to that program, one that deals with psychokinesis or psychoenergetics.
One of the things I've been wondering about is have they been using remote viewing as a bit of a distraction to the actual real core of the program that the military was developing, which was remote influencing?
Yeah, and when you look through the declassified documentation, you can see different experimentation that was done in this area by the military. However, it seems to me that there's maybe less information on this component as compared to the remote viewing side, which makes me wonder if there isn't some of this information is still, say, classified, possibly. One of the first places that I see information associated with remote influencing, although it is a wired process, is an NSA document 1964 where an Air Force officer goes to a hospital where they have an experiment set up in which the participants are using their minds to turn on and off a switch.
What they were doing was they were using alpha brainwaves to amplify the effects that were recorded on an EEG, an electroencephalogram, when the participants were just using intention to flip the light on and off by flipping that switch on and off with the power of intent. There were 32 people that were involved in the study, and their success rate was really quite surprising.
That, of course, is more of a wired experiment, but we can see the translation of sort of those aspects into other documentation later on where they were working on more of a wireless kind of interaction. And you see the alpha state come up consistently in these experiments.
What's interesting about this is that when we as remote viewers are told to use any kind of brainwave entrainment devices or techniques, we're usually told that we want to entrain the theta brainwave state, the dreamlike state. But when we look through the military documents, the declassified documents, they're all referencing the primacy of the alpha brainwave state to create better effects for remote viewing and remote influencing. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
It is actually very interesting, and it is something that people should consider at least or pay attention to, in my opinion. Before we jump into the military experiments, some of the earlier things that occurred were with Ingo Swan, where he affected a magnetometer needle with his mind. And it's something that you can see in Third Eye Spies, but that wasn't the only time that he affected something remotely.
Yes, he started working with Gertrude Schmeidler on an experiment where Ingo was successfully able to change the temperature in a room. And in that instance, he was using intentional effort to do so.
So those are a few instances that we know about that were outside of the kind of the military program aspect. But within the program itself, we had one of the documents mentions that Miss Worrell was working with two doctors on a cloud chamber, and the doctors were able to witness that she could affect the cloud within this chamber at a distance up to 600 miles away. And this was something that they found to be quite shocking.
I think that's really incredible. These days, I think what we find more talked about in the remote viewing community are the conferences and the events. It's more about moving tinfoil on the head of a pin or spoon bending. But this research that they were doing 50 years ago was significantly more advanced.
It also shows up in the movie Men Who Stare at Goats, where they affect a cloud, they do some cloud busting. It makes me think that this might be related to that particular experiment. But those weren't the only ones. They had other experiments that were associated with the effects on blood.
What was interesting about this study was that they were able to successfully protect blood in salt water from damage or slow down the rate of damage to the blood cells. And they were doing it both on their own blood and on the blood of the other participants. And they were able to, at a statistically significant level, have that protective effect.
It's quite fascinating to me to see that they could affect remote samples of the blood at a distance with their mind or their intent, which is just amazing. In another experiment, they looked at two individuals at two different locations, and one was sort of the sender, one was the receiver. And the sender side, they subjected the sender to small pulsations of light, and they hooked the receiver up to an EEG. And at least one person, I believe it was HH, which is probably Hala Hamid, her body essentially responded to these pulsations of light that were affecting the person at the other location, which is amazing. So she wasn't necessarily consciously aware that this was happening, but the EEG was picking up that this was occurring.
At the University of Edinburgh, they replicated some of these studies, and they also had the sender and the receiver in shielded rooms, and they would flash a light to the sender, and they were measuring the evoked potentials in the neurons of the receiver's brain through, like David said, the EEG. And they did find that when the flashlight would go off, the sender's brain would respond with the electrical impulse in the neurons, as would the receiver's simultaneously. And so these studies aren't just described in these declassified documents. You can also find them in published journals from the Kessler unit at the University of Edinburgh.
And people might wonder, what are some of the reasons why the military would investigate these types of experiments? In the case of the light experiment, it's that they were looking at ways for a prisoner to communicate information remotely without any other means of essentially doing that. In the case of the light essentially being replicated across to a secondary person, you could imagine where if the prisoner could create Morse code kind of effect against their body in some form. Maybe it's shock, maybe it's light. Like there may be other methods that they could employ easily. The receiver then could get information about their location and things of that nature, which is quite fascinating.
Yes, because it means that you wouldn't only need to have trained remote viewers trying to remote view where maybe a hostage is kept. If the hostage was a military person that was trained in this method, then you could just have the receiver essentially have their brain wired up, and you look at the EEG and you get the Morse code signal, I guess, that way, which is really bizarre and fascinating, I think, to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And another indication within their own documents as to some of the reasons why they were looking at this type of activity. One was associated with the concept of affecting like a guidance system on a missile at a distance with the mind. This was something that they were thinking about as an application. They had seen or heard rumors of some of the things that the Russians and I think the Chinese were able to do in this sector. So this started to get them concerned about whether this type of activity was possible, because if it was, now they have to think about it in regards to first strike attacks and things of that nature.
However, there are also darker implications to this, because although this could be used for good applications, it could be used, and they documented this, they were researching this, they were testing this to remote influence people in negative ways. And one of those things that we found very interesting was this idea of remote hypnosis. So being able to put a subject in a hypnotic state remotely from a distance. So if you are targeting someone either for some kind of Manchurian candidate thing, or if you're wanting to put an agent to sleep so that your agents can, I don't know, I guess pass by them, that idea of being able to put them in a hypnotic state remotely, but also then entrain their brain so that it becomes more and more easy to do that. We found that a little bit, well, I find that very concerning.
There are other experiments and objectives within these declassified documents if you want to go look for them yourselves. We're just kind of touching on some of the highlights that we saw as we skimmed through some of these documents. We'll leave you with one of the other documents that I found, which is interesting, that actually discusses the method of remote influencing that they use. So if we think about COV being a methodology, you could look at this document as an introduction to the methodology of remote influencing.
Back in 1994, in this document that we're sharing here, you can see that Dr. Ed May was discussing, on behalf of the Science Applications International Corporation, their cognitive sciences laboratory, Dr. Dolan's remote influencing techniques.
They had two individuals. One was trying to influence the other individual, and they created a rapport over several days, and they were able to actually see some influence from one person to the other. So in summation, I would just say I find it to be kind of interesting that with as much information that is within the declassified documents, I don't know how much is actually still classified, that there isn't sort of more awareness from the community. They haven't either replicated experiments, talked about the experiments, things of that nature.
Or if they have, that it hasn't been disseminated through the community in a way that people are more familiar with these things, or that they're more talked about, that they're more incorporated into our practices as remote viewers. Even though we're not necessarily setting out to be remote influencers, there is overlap, and a lot of the remote influencing has to do with having that sharpness of intent, and that also helps remote viewing. In Dr. Dolan's remote influencing training system, he places a lot of emphasis on the development of visualization skills to be able to visualize something very clearly to either send it to the receiver or to remote influence the receiver by sending them imagery that influences their thoughts, their behavior, their choices. We find it a little bit interesting that in a lot of the public remote viewing methods, imagery, visualizing the imagery is a little bit less emphasized. And we wonder if maybe as the military was discovering how effective imagery was for remote influencing, visualization was for remote influencing, maybe the more they de-emphasize that within the remote viewing training tools that they were making public.
It's definitely an interesting thought. So although this won't be the final word on this particular topic because there are a lot of documents to cover, we hope that you find this information to be of interest. And we thank you for watching. And until next time, bye.
Good night.